Grace found herself increasingly frustrated with her husband, Edward, a classic mama's boy, who became noticeably absent from household chores after they exchanged vows. His dependence on her became painfully evident when she mentioned an upcoming business trip. Panic set in as he exclaimed, "Who will take care of me while you're gone?" This reaction led to a heated argument, prompting Grace to leave for her week-long journey. Upon her return, Grace discovered a note next to completed divorce papers. It read, "Since you abandoned the housework, I'm going back to my parents. Consider the divorce papers and think it over." Initially, rage boiled inside her at his audacity to threaten divorce, but as she calmed down, clarity began to emerge. Perhaps this was the push she needed. Maybe a divorce wasn't such a bad idea after all. The very next day, she filed the papers. The following morning, Edward stormed in, demanding to know where the divorce papers were. When Grace informed him that she had filed them, he broke down, utterly baffled and crying uncontrollably. At 32, Grace had been married just over a year. After college, she diligently climbed the ranks at a prominent company and, approaching her 30s without a romantic partner, faced pressure from her parents to settle down. This led her to reluctantly join a dating agency, where she met Edward. He was soft-spoken and a few years younger, and they connected over several dates. His respectful demeanor made her believe he was the one. When he proposed, she was overjoyed, envisioning a life together. However, their marriage unveiled challenges she hadn't anticipated. During a visit to her parents after their engagement, they impressed upon her that marriage is a lifelong commitment. "Grace, always be there for Edward," they advised, and she nodded in agreement, while Edward listened intently. Next, they visited Edward's parents. His father, Arthur, welcomed her warmly, but his mother, Michelle, was more reserved, scrutinizing her before bluntly asking, "Is this the one?" Edward confidently replied, "Yep, Mommy. I want to marry her." Grace was taken aback by his use of Mommy, while Michelle's directness caught her off guard. Arthur stepped in to assure her they were very happy about the marriage, but warned that Edward might be a bit of a challenge. Grace reassured them that she adored Edward's gentle side and believed they would support each other. They celebrated their wedding with a low-key ceremony, and to their delight, Grace's parents gifted them a condo, marking the beginning of their married life. However, it soon became evident that Edward was unaccustomed to household responsibilities. One morning, while Grace was busy with laundry and preparing breakfast, Edward's alarm rang at 8 a.m., yet he continued to sleep soundly. Despite her efforts to wake him, he wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she pulled off his covers and gently shook him. He finally opened his eyes, exclaiming, "Wow, it's 8:10 already. Why didn't you wake me up?" Grace reminded him that she had tried, and that his alarm was blaring too. As he shuffled to the table, he complained about his breakfast. "Hey, Grace, this egg is too runny. I can't eat this unless it's well done. Make it over," he demanded. Caught off guard, Grace struggled to hold back her irritation and snapped, "Then don't eat it." After redoing the eggs and letting the coffee cool, he ate hurriedly, leaving his plate on the table as he rushed toward the restroom. "Wait up. You know you should clean up after yourself," she called after him, but he dismissed her concerns, saying he was short on time. Annoyed, Grace paused her makeup routine to clean the dishes while picking out her outfit. Then, Edward called out for her again. "Grace, over here. Help with my tie." He stood there with the tie limply around his neck, looking utterly helpless. "Seriously? You can't even tie your tie? What did you do before we got married?" she asked. He sheepishly admitted, "Mommy always did it." With a deep exhale, she tied his tie, and somehow they both managed to leave the house. This dynamic became their routine. Edward never helped with housework, and it felt like Grace was juggling everything while babysitting him. Every time an issue arose in their marriage, Edward would reference his mother, Michelle, saying things like, "Mommy did it this way," or "With Mommy, it went like that." This constant comparison wore on Grace, and as the pressures of their relationship mounted over the year, thoughts of divorce began to creep into her mind. Her father's insistence that marriage is forever echoed in her thoughts, tempering her frustrations but making her feel trapped. An unexpected work situation led to a week-long business trip starting the next day. When Grace broke the news to Edward that evening, he was absorbed in his video game and clearly surprised. A business trip for a whole week? It's out of my hands. Work's calling, she explained. His irritation surfaced as he responded, "No way. Who's going to cover for you here for a week?" Grace insisted that he would have to step up, adding, "It's about time you got a grip on the household duties." Locking eyes with her, Edward put down his controller. Isn't the wife supposed to care for her husband in the house? Are you just bailing on that? His question reflected outdated expectations, and Grace found herself frustrated. That's such old-school thinking. We both have jobs. We should be a team, she countered. Edward shot back. That's not how I see it. Mommy was always on top of things at home. Grace pointed out. But she was a stay-at-home mom. Edward bristled, offended by her remark. What's your deal? Taking shots at me and my mommy, he retorted. I'm not, but let's be real. You're a mama's boy. His defensiveness escalated, and Grace felt her frustration peak. Face it, you can't get up without help. You can't even tie your tie, and you won't lift a finger around the house. You're constantly comparing me to your mom. For once, handle your stuff. Really? You're gonna come at me like that? That's why I was iffy about marrying someone older. You should have sided with mommy and chosen a younger, perkier girl, he shot back. His words struck a nerve, and their conversation spiraled into a major blowout. Grace tried to anchor the conversation by reminding him, you shouldn't say stuff like that. We're married. But the tension was palpable, revealing the deep rifts that had formed in their relationship. When Edward hinted at divorce during the heated argument, Grace was taken aback. With a smug tone, he challenged her. You can't possibly want a divorce, can you? You wouldn't want to be labeled divorced. Think about what your dad said about sticking together. Then, with sharp finality, he added, well, I just did. If you go on this business trip and leave me here alone, I'm seriously considering a divorce. With those words, he stormed off to their bedroom, leaving Grace stunned. Despite the shock, the idea of divorce lingered in her mind, something she had wrestled with before but feared would disappoint her parents. That night, heavy with these thoughts, she went to bed. The next day, Grace woke early to prepare for her trip, the fallout from their argument still weighing on her. She nudged Edward, who was curled up under the covers, saying, I'm heading out. You better wake up, or you'll be late for work. His response was a sleepy mumble, unintelligible and dismissive. Rolling her eyes, she left. A few hours later, she received a text from him. You barely tried to wake me. Now I'm running late. Did you really go on that trip? She quickly replied, I did wake you up, and yes, I'm on my trip. I'll be back in a week. He read her message but didn't reply. During her trip, Grace decided to call her parents to update them on Edward's behavior and share her growing inclination toward divorce. She braced herself for a lecture, unsure how they would react to the possibility of her marriage ending. However, their response took her by surprise. We had no idea he behaved like this. Take your time to think, but don't force yourself to stay in a situation that isn't right. Always remember, we're in your corner no matter what you decide. Their words of unconditional support brought tears to her eyes. Upon returning from her business trip, Grace felt a mix of clarity and determination. She knew a serious conversation with Edward was inevitable. If he showed no signs of change, she was ready to consider divorce more seriously. Her mind buzzed with thoughts as she walked into their house late that evening, only to find that Edward wasn't home yet. As she looked around, a set of signed divorce papers and a note on the table caught her attention. The note read, Since you ditched the housework, I'm heading back to my folks. Check out the divorce papers and think things over. Initially, her reaction was one of rage. How dare he threaten her with divorce? But as her anger subsided, she began to see the situation differently. Maybe this was a sign that ending things might not be such a bad idea after all. With that realization, she decided to file the papers. When the divorce was finalized, she felt a heavy weight lift from her shoulders. That evening, she went to bed and slept more soundly than she had in a long time. The next morning, as she enjoyed a peaceful cup of coffee, the door swung open and Edward walked in, clearly upset. "Why didn't you come to my parents' place to apologize? What's gotten into you?" he demanded, his temper flaring. Noticing the empty spot where the divorce papers had been, his expression shifted from anger to shock. "Hold on. Where are the divorce papers?" he asked. "Oh, I filed them," she replied calmly. "You did what?" he exclaimed, looking as if he had been slapped. "You went through with it? Thanks for signing them." "It made everything smoother," she said, trying to keep her composure. His disbelief was palpable as he struggled to process what had just happened. "Have you lost your mind?" Edward exclaimed, his astonishment at my decisiveness clear. My calm demeanor sent him into a frenzy. "That's it. I'm calling my parents," he declared. Unfazed, I replied, "Knock yourself out." I felt assured that I had made the right decision for myself. About an hour after our confrontation, a sense of clarity settled within me. When Edward's parents, Michelle and Arthur, arrived at our apartment, Michelle immediately spotted me and dramatically exclaimed, "You! How could you just divorce Edward like that? What's wrong with you?" I replied coolly, "If he had the divorce papers all filled out and ready to go, doesn't that suggest he wanted out? Is that a problem?" Michelle retorted, "How can you be so bold when you're just his wife?" Before the situation escalated further, Arthur intervened, his voice firm enough to silence the room. "Grace, can you walk us through what happened?" I agreed and began detailing the ongoing issues, including our argument before my trip and the divorce papers Edward had left for me. I expressed that I was at my wit's end and felt it seemed like he wanted a divorce, so I decided to go along with it. I maintained eye contact with Arthur, hoping to convey the depth of my frustration. Just as I finished, Edward interjected, "Mom, Dad, come on. Can't you see she's out of line? Tell her off." Michelle quickly sided with Edward, exclaiming, "Oh, Edward, my poor baby. She's being so hasty. You should reverse the divorce right now." "There's no reversing it. Our divorce is final. We're strangers now," I stated firmly. Michelle's face turned red as she opened her mouth to respond, but Arthur cut her off. "Zip it, Michelle." He then turned to me, apologizing for Edward's behavior. Facing Edward, whose eyes were wide with surprise, Arthur continued, "You bonehead. I knew you had issues, but using divorce papers as a threat? Unbelievable. You had this coming." Michelle tried to interject again, but Arthur wouldn't let up. "It's partly on you, Michelle. You spoiled him. Watch out. If you keep this up, I might divorce you too." The tension in the room was palpable as Arthur confronted the reality of the situation, leaving Edward and Michelle speechless. After the intense discussion, Michelle appeared visibly shaken, her mind lingering on Arthur's unexpected threat of divorce. She murmured to herself, troubled. Arthur then turned his attention back to me, his expression marked by sincere regret. "Grace, I deeply regret the trouble our clueless son has caused you. It's clear he has a lot to learn. Please move on and find happiness in your life," he implored. His concern felt genuine, and I thanked him for his understanding as I watched him leave, taking a dejected Edward with him. It didn't take long for the news to spread through our circle. Arthur had decided to sever financial and emotional ties with Edward, a drastic move aimed at pushing him towards self-sufficiency. Soon after, Edward's life spiraled downward. He moved into a modest, somewhat neglected apartment, his first experience living truly on his own. The transition was anything but smooth. His new home quickly descended into chaos, mirroring his disorganized personal life. With no one to rely on and a habit of tardiness, he soon found himself unemployed, unable to adhere to a schedule. Meanwhile, the dynamics within his family deteriorated further. Michelle, who had always meddled in Edward's affairs, crossed boundaries one too many times, resulting in serious fallout with Arthur. This ultimately led to their separation. Michelle moved in with Edward, and together they struggled to find stability, scraping by with low-end jobs. Their lives became a series of unfortunate events and poor decisions, with no clear path to improvement. In stark contrast, my life took a different turn. Free from the daily stresses and emotional drain of my relationship with Edward, I found myself alone in our condo, which now felt surprisingly spacious and full of potential. With renewed energy and focus, I dedicated myself to my career. The absence of Edward's negative influence allowed me to excel at work, and my professional life flourished as a result. Feeling liberated and optimistic, I embraced my newfound independence. My living space transformed into a true sanctuary where I could relax and plan for the future. The improvement in my work life was palpable. Each day brought a sense of excitement and anticipation for what lay ahead. The contrast between my thriving existence and Edward and Michelle's downward trajectory was stark. While they were no longer a part of my life, the lessons learned from our time together resonated deeply, reinforcing my commitment to personal growth and happiness.